Hi folks, this is Ian's Movies by Month, bringing you my reviews of the films I've been watching during April on streaming, Blu-ray and DVD, because obviously all the cinemas are still shut, and they've been shut by COVID-19 for quite a little while. And so everything I've watched should be easy enough for you to come by from the comfort of your own sofa. Now, because everyone's been in lockdown, me and a few pals decided to set up a weekly film night, and some of the films we've been watching have been from that fine stable of movies that should probably be left at the bottom of a bin. Yeah, they're all probably kind of bad, but they've all been ones we found on Amazon Prime. So the quality of some of this stuff might be a little bargain basement, but you might like it, some of it might sound like fun. So to start things off, the first thing I watched was a horror movie, because you know I love horror movies, and that was Doctor Sleep, which is the sequel to the very famous Stanley Kubrick movie The Shining, the one where Jack Nicholson goes mad while he's staying in a hotel over winter while being haunted by a bunch of creepy ghosts. And you've probably seen that since it's one of the most famous horror movies ever made. But Doctor Sleep picks up with young Danny, the wee boy from the first story, but now he's all grown up into Ewan McGregor, and he's a total alcoholic who happens to have a sort of magic power called The Shining. And he ends up kind of psychically connected to this super powerful shiner called Abra, who's a young girl. But there's also a gang of evil vampire ghosty types who can soak the magic out shiners when they die and eat it, and they're on their trails. And it's a kind of interesting film because it's made by Mike Flanagan, the guy who did the Hill House TV show and Gerald's Game, which I reviewed the other month. But with him like wrangling all the different versions of the film and the book story of The Shining into one sequel that still works, because if you knew or not, the original Shining movie was very, very different from the book, and this one has to tie up with a lot of different things, like the fact that in the original book, the hotel burned down at the end, but in the film it didn't. It's a really interesting film, and for the most part it kind of works, although it is a little bit overlong, and the ending where they inevitably return to the Overlook Hotel, like despite looking absolutely amazing, kind of overdoes it and ends up feeling cheesy rather than fun or clever. I mean, it's slightly unfortunate, but overall, it's an absolutely fantastic film right up until that point. And I enjoyed it a lot. And if you're into The Shining, oh, it's a pretty great sequel. So I mean, this is a 4 out of 5 film, and definitely one for horror fans to check out. But it's not only movies I like to watch, because another thing I saw was a fascinating documentary, and that was called SuperSize Me 2 Holy Chicken. Now, you might remember back, there was a film called SuperSize Me, and it was kind of a famous story about a guy who ate nothing but McDonald's for a month back in the early 2000s, and it was really shocking, like how ill it made him and how fat it made him, to the point where it literally made McDonald's change their whole look and menu to try and be healthier, like as a PR move. Well, this time, it's the same guy, but he's trying to take a swing at the chicken market, which is a really big market in America, like chicken sandwiches and stuff like that. And he looks into not only how chickens are bred and bought and fed and cared for, and what this means and what you can actually say on the adverts when you're trying to sell them, all in the process of setting up his very own chicken sandwich fast food restaurant. And it's genuinely a really eye-opening stuff. I mean, especially considering there's an awful lot of difference between the way that chickens are bred and reared in the UK and the way that it happens in America. Especially because I used to live near a chicken farm as a kid, and it's totally different how it's done in America. And it was really the charisma and the clever editing that make this work, because otherwise it's not like a shock doc full of horrific images, you know, like some of the other ones, like Food Inc. and stuff like that.
The industry doesn't want you to know the truth about what you're eating, because if you knew, you might not want to eat it.
But rather it was more just pointing out how many crazy lies that are in the food standards system. It might well make you think twice about getting a chicken sandwich, but I don't think this is actually going to make anyone vegan. It's more likely to make you annoyed and want to actually speak to a politician to make them change the rules so that they can't lie so much on their advertising. So a great big 4 hens to this flock of 5. But Ian, I hear you cry, do you never watch foreign films? Do you never watch cartoons? And to that imaginary person saying this stuff to me, I would say, yeah, I actually do both. And because Netflix have actually put the entire back catalogue of the films by the Japanese company Studio Ghibli on their roster in the UK. I mean, they're like Japanese hand-drawn equivalent of like Pixar movies. If you've never actually seen them, you really should, because they do absolutely amazing movies. Some of them are kind of sad, some of them are kind of silly, some of them are just quirky. But yeah, I thought I'd check out some of the ones that I haven't seen before. So I watched one called Ocean Waves, which is actually one of their less known movies. And as it turns out, it's quite a low-key story of a Japanese schoolboy and his best mate living in a wee provincial town. And then a new girl arrives who's like been brought up in Tokyo. And there's this kind of mini love triangle developing between them. And it's all really about how Taku, the main character, slowly starts to get to know this seemingly difficult city girl that his best mate has a crush on. And then ends up finding himself more and more being drawn to her and getting embroiled in like her silly schemes and stuff. And it's clearly lovingly made. And I'm really glad I watched it. I mean, it's not their best work, it's not the most spectacular thing you've ever seen, but it's also a lot better than an awful lot of other animated stuff you'd see. And the story is a little bit slow and maybe a little predictable for some. And if you've never watched any Studio Ghibli, I'd probably maybe recommend starting with something else, maybe something like Howl's Moving Castle or Spirited Away. But yeah, it's a totally pleasant movie. It's something nice, it's peaceful, it's relaxing. I mean, yeah, you could say it's as relaxing as ocean waves. So I'd give it a 3 out of 5 and say definitely one that's worth checking out if you just fancy something along these lines. But let's get serious now, because I did actually watch a vaguely serious film, and that film was 6 Days. And that's a Netflix movie that's a dramatic reconstruction of when the Iranian embassy in London was taken over by terrorists in 1980. And it was all about how the police chief inspector ends up dealing with the terrorists over the phone, and how Kate Adie, the reporter, reports it all for the BBC, and also at the same time telling the story of the SAS and how they worked out with lots of different eventualities, practicing and preparing to try and get the hostages back and maybe kill all the terrorists. If you're from the UK, and like me, like 1980 wasn't a year where you were old enough to actually remember, then all you know about this story is probably the very end of it, which I'm not going to spoil just in case, anyone watching this actually doesn't know anything about it. But this is actually a pretty taut and fascinating thriller, also a bit of a drama, because it's really more about the personalities in play rather than like the big slam bang action, although there is a little of that. And loads of it is down to just some really fraught phone conversations with Mark Strong as the cop and Ben Turner playing Salim, the terrorist leader. And the rapport between the two of these guys is really fantastic, and it drives an awful lot of the film, especially as things are trying to spiral out of control. And if you like these sort of thrillers and recent historical films, and especially if you've got a soft spot for Billy Elliot with a gun swearing his head off, you'll probably really enjoy this. So yeah, that's a 4 out of 5 for me. Definitely worth checking out, especially if you've any interest in this kind of thing. Next up was a kind of wacky ghost house horror movie called Haunt. And it's this kind of a strange premise where a bunch of teenagers go into a ghost house, but one that they've just happened by in the middle of the countryside on Halloween. And of course things end up going from bad to worse because they get split up and one by one they start disappearing, because it turns out it might secretly be a death house of murder. And this is kind of a film that's in the style of what was called the torture porn movies of the early 2000s. Films like the Saw and Hostel franchises, where basically it's just an excuse to put someone in a bad situation and then have blood and gore and death happen to them. And in fact, it's kind of very similar in a lot of ways to the film Saw 2, where all the people got locked in a house full of traps. But this at least does have a few interesting turns. And I'm going to say it now, this is like a straight 2 out of 5 film. It's not that great. And the plot, the only good thing is it kept you guessing a little bit as to what exactly was going on, and whether or not this was actually just part of a scare house, and whether or not it was actually real. But once you realise that, it starts descending into complete stupidity, with characters acting in weird ways that seem completely contrary to common sense, which I know is a big thing in horror movies, but yeah, this is not a film that you would go out of your way to watch. Definitely one for the absolute horror fans only. But again, not everything is horror, and another film I saw that wasn't horror at all was a comedy from Steven Soderbergh.
Looks thicker, more like vicar.
No, it has to be grosser. It's green.
No, not that guy. No, that's Stephen Sondheim, the composer. This was Steven Soderbergh. Steven Soderbergh, the director, who you might have seen some of his more quirky films, like the legal drama Erin Brockovich, or maybe his philosophical space movie Solaris. But no, the film I saw was Logan Lucky, which is far more in the style of stuff like his Ocean's 11 movies or Out of Sight, in that it's technically a heist movie. You see, Logan Lucky is all about Channing Tatum, who plays one of the Logan brothers. And he's just been sacked from his workman job, and along with his disabled bartender brother, they decide to break Daniel Craig out of prison for the night and end up robbing the Speedway. And it's pretty typical heist kind of stuff, with Soderbergh's usually malarkey, although the only difference is that everybody in this is playing a bunch of blue-collar redneck hicks, and the whole escapade is far more of a comedy than it is a serious movie. And there's an awful lot of laughs to be had, but the film does meander a wee bit, and it kind of drags at points, especially towards the end. I mean, in fact, this is a movie where it reached the end and I kept wondering why the film was still going, and it had 20 minutes to go. And it's long beyond the point that you actually think it should have ended, so maybe a little judicious editing might have been a good idea there. But it's certainly not a bad movie, and everybody involved seems to be having a good time. But it's kind of middle of the road, so again, it's a 3 out of 5 for Logan Lucky. Maybe one for, again, the heist movie fans. So yeah, if you did actually like the Ocean's 11 movies, check it out. It's not as good as them, and obviously it's a totally different cast, but maybe worth seeing. And the last movie I saw in April was actually a wee classic that I'd been wanting to watch for literally years. You see, back when I was wee, we used to rent VHS videotapes out of a local shop, and I used to always see the cover of this movie called The Stuff, and it was always there on the shelf, but I was too young to rent it out, and finally, it came on Amazon Prime, and I remembered that this is that film that I'd always been wanting to watch. And it turns out it's a really cheesy 80s tongue-in-cheek horror movie about a private investigator called in to look at supposed deaths involved with the creation of a yogurt-like dessert called The Stuff. And it turns out that the yogurt is actually some kind of evil alien organism that got drilled up out the ground by accident, and it's now taken over the human race. And it's kind of hard to describe this movie in a lot of ways because mainly it's horribly written and the plot is kind of nonsensical, and occasionally it doesn't really make a lot of sense, and you feel like the actors, maybe they're only half in on the joke, and a few of them seem to definitely be drunk when they were filming it. But it's probably also why it's an awful lot of fun. That and the fact there's actually quite a lot of money involved in this movie because they blow up things all over the place and they seem to have had a decent budget. And after a short while, the complete bonkersness of the whole thing starts to get quite enjoyable. And considering the director is somebody who came up through the ranks making exploitation films in the 1970s, maybe that makes a bit of sense, like the sort of style and tone of it all. Still, it's abjectly silly stuff and definitely not worth anything more than a 3 out of 5, being absolutely generous. But it's definitely one that if you've got a glass of wine or a beer in your hand and you watch it with some pals, you might have a bit of a giggle. So yeah, that was me and that was April. And yeah, some of the films this month were kind of bizarre, but it was a bit of a bizarre time, so I was watching a lot of kind of naff silly things. But hopefully it'll be back to regular programming a wee bit for the next month's roundup, because I did watch some more sensible things after that. And I'll be back with May's movie viewings as soon as I can. In the meantime, please remember you can follow me on Twitter if you don't already, chat to me there, you can join the Facebook group, and if you feel really generous, remember you can sign up to my Patreon. And until next time, I've been Ian, and these have been my grumpy opinions. And a special thanks to everybody listening, and especially my patrons, and most especially to Michelle Forbes and Judith Coloma, my top tier patrons. Thank you everybody. Everybody stay safe. Cheerio.